Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are. Welcome to our event, The 21st Century Management and How to Start the Transformation Process. We're almost 300 participants attending from all over the world. We believe you are like us. You want to better understand and lead your company in the new century, which is characterized by rapid changes, new digital technologies that disrupt not only single companies and most organizations, but total industries, and also how human beings socialize and live their lives. If you took part of the Global Drucker Forum 2020, maybe the #1 conference on leadership, you know, however, that the world lacks a common picture on how to lead a company in a totally connected IoT age. The Renan Hui Silicon Valley Center has as its mission to support forward-thinking executives, managers, leaders in understanding the new conditions for leading their organizations in the 21st century. The center focuses on knowledge generation and dissemination to this target group in many forms, such as this kind of events, as well as new generation of certificate management courses. The Silicon Valley Center is, however, not alone. We're just one center of 6 all around the world, and we all share the same passion and the mission. Today, you will learn from Stephen Denning, Bill Fisher, Stuart Craner, and Kevin Nolan, all distinguished experts in the field of the new management. And we will try to answer questions such as why we cannot continue with the 20th century management model, and what are the main management principles for the 21st century. We will also get a unique insight into the Renan Hui business model that was developed by Haier when they realized 15 years ago that they had to transform themselves from a traditional home appliance company into a company that fit the new era. Finally, you will learn how this model has been disseminated to General Electric Appliances, a Haier company and an American company, and what effects this have had on the financial results, as well as on people satisfaction. We will also learn about other companies also transforming as we speak, or that just decided in the very beginning to build a whole new management model that was better fit for this new economy. I do hope you will enjoy this event, one of the first of many from this center. As a small gift from us, you will all receive the book Ecosystem Inc. that is produced and distributed by Thinkers 50. And also 8 of you will be able to get one of 2 of Steve Denning's best-selling books. And by that, I want to give the word over to Thinkers 50 and Stuart Craner, that will be the moderator of this event. Thinkers 50 is a world-known brand for identifying, ranking, and sharing extraordinary management and business thinking. Stuart, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Annika, and thank you for joining us today. As Annika said, I'm Stuart Craner, co-founder of the Thinkers 50, the global platform for management ideas. I'm delighted to be moderating this 90 minutes of insight and debate on the ideas and practice underlying 21st century management. So during the session, please send over your comments and questions at any time. There'll be plenty of time for our experts to answer your questions, and there are even prizes for the best questions, as Annika said. 20 years ago, at the end of the last century, I wrote a book called The Management Century, which looked at the rise of management in the 20th century, from Henry Ford and Frederick Winslow Taylor's scientific management in the first decades of the century, through the rise of strategic management in the 1960s to re-engineering in the 1990s. The parting corporate role model I presented was Dell, which seemed to me an organization poised for greatness. A lot has happened since then. Dell has pivoted numerous times, and we've also seen the rise of miraculous new technologies, new business concepts like agility, lean, and scrum, and a few shocks along the way. Yet there is still a sense that the nature of 21st century management and the shape of 21st century organizations is only slowly being figured out. This webinar should help, I hope, clarify some of the confusion around 21st century management and present you with a potent mix of ideas and insight into best practice. Later, as Annika said, we will hear from Bill Fisher from IMD, author of Reinventing Giants, and from Kevin Nolan, who's the CEO of GE Appliances. Bill is joining us today from New York. He was born in Brooklyn before it was cool, and Kevin is in Louisville, Kentucky. They will provide on-the-ground insights into the innovative management of the Chinese company Haier and its unique management model. Haier is now the world's leading white goods manufacturer and one of the great corporate stories of our times. But first, we're delighted to have Steve Denning plotting a way towards new management principles for the 21st century. Steve is a veritable Renaissance man. He's a poet, a novelist, a former executive at the World Bank, a must-read Forbes columnist, and the author of a series of brilliant books, including The Age of Agile, The Leader's Guide to Radical Management, and The Secret Language of Leadership. Steve will present his unique take on 21st century management, and then be here live to take questions and join the debate. So, Steve Denning, the virtual stage is yours.
My name is Steve Denning, and I'm talking to you today about 21st century management, what it takes to create and lead an organization in this complex, fast-changing world of the 21st century. In case you're wondering how I got here, well, I was born in Sydney, Australia. I worked there as a lawyer, studied some more law at Oxford University, and then I joined the World Bank in Washington, D.C. And I worked in the World Bank for several decades. It was run for some time by Robert Mcnamara. Now, Robert Mcnamara was one of the most famous managers of the 20th century. And so he ran the World Bank like the 20th century bank. It was very disciplined and it was very effective. And we kept making more and more loans. As it happened, a 20th century bank wasn't a very good fit for the purpose of the World Bank. Although our name was a bank, our actual purpose was the mercurial task of relieving global poverty, which is really quite different from the business of making loans. We spent an enormous amount of time and effort in designing and getting approval for the perfect project for a loan. We often found that when we got to implementation, the situation had changed and our clients wanted something quite different from the perfect project that we had designed. So for much of my time in the World Bank, I kept wondering, surely there must be a better way to manage work like ours. The dilemma for a big firm like the World Bank is pictured in this chart. We had to choose between, on the one hand, speedy innovation, which wasn't very disciplined, or getting disciplined execution, which was really rather slow. It seemed as though we couldn't have both. We could have one or the other, but not both. In those days, I came across some small experiments, but they didn't seem to work at scale, and the experiments didn't seem to last. I left the World Bank in 2000 after inspiring a big strategic shift there, and I spent the next 10 years showing the Fortune 500 companies how to inspire big strategic shifts. Around 2008, I noticed that the shifts I had helped inspire in these firms didn't seem to last. There was always a different reason. The firm would commit to change, start implementing change, and then after a while, slide back to the way it used to be. Why did this happen? I set out to discover the reason. Eventually, I did find some answers in an unexpected place, software development, and I have been learning and writing about it ever since. These software developers had figured out how to get both speedy innovation and disciplined execution at the same time. They didn't have to choose. They found a way to get both. And I thought, this is amazing. No one knows about it. I have to tell the world about it. And in retrospect, it's no wonder that these ideas emerged in software development. That's because software developers were trying to cope with rapid change and immense complexity. A lot of their projects never even finished. Billions of dollars were being wasted. Software developers had to find a better way. And given that introduction, I'm probably going to surprise you by praising the very 20th century management practices that I had trouble with under Robert Mcnamara at the World Bank. In fact, I really do believe that those 20th century management practices are one of the greatest human accomplishments. They produced the greatest improvement in the material well-being of the human race in thousands of years. And what is 20th century management? Well, there were, of course, many variations and experiments, but 20th century firms tended to converge on three core principles. First and most important was the goal of the firm. For most firms, the goal was to produce a reliable product for sale. The second principle concerned the structure of work. This was essentially bureaucracy, individuals reporting to bosses and filling roles. Workers had to do what they were told. The necessity of organizing work this way flowed from the goals of efficiency and reliability. The staff might like doing their work, but they weren't necessarily motivated to do so efficiently or to deliver it on time. For this to happen, they had to be told what to do, and their performance had to be closely monitored. The third principle concerned the firm's dynamic, which was vertical hierarchy of authority. Strategy got set at the top, power trickled down, big leaders appointed little leaders, and so on down the line. Since the boss knew best, it made sense for the boss to decide what the firm should be doing, even if others thought differently. Again, this principle flowed from the first two principles. Since the goals were efficiency and reliability, and the work is organized as bureaucracy, there had to be a vertical hierarchy of authority. And these three principles drove the behavior of most big firms for the last 100 years. And they continue to drive many organizations today. And let me say a word about principles. What exactly do I mean by principles? By principles, I mean the prevailing mindset of people in the firm. I mean the DNA of the firm. This is not necessarily what the management says it is doing. It is what the management is actually doing. The principles explain why the firm acts the way it does. The principles can become so obvious and self-evident that they even become invisible to the participants. They come like the water that the fish are swimming in. The fish can't see the water because the water is everywhere. Yet the staff can deduce what the principles are from what is going on. They can see who gets promoted and who doesn't, why resources are allocated the way they are, why hard decisions are made this way, not that. These principles of management, once established, then lead on to certain processes which support and deliver on the principles in a systematic fashion. The principles are the why of the firm. The processes are the how of the firm, how the firm achieves the why on a systematic basis. And the processes flow from the principles. For instance, strategy. Because the firm's goal is to maximize sales, strategy is mainly about coping with competition. And innovation. Because generating new products is risky, innovation mostly focuses on enhancing existing products and services. Likewise, sales and marketing. Sales and marketing supports the goal of selling, inducing customers to buy the firm's current products and services. Human resources, HR, as the name implies, generally involves treating and controlling the staff as resources. And budget, because the vertical hierarchy of authority leads to a structure of silos, the budget is often a battle among the silos for resources. These processes, once in place, reinforce the principles. So the processes can acquire a life of their own. They grind onwards like a machine, even if they are out of sync with changes in the principles of the firm or at odds with the top management and what they are trying to do. This machine-like system of management was very effective. It's disciplined, it's coherent, it's internally consistent. It led to the greatest improvement in the human condition in history. It's still applicable in some settings, such as commodities, and it is still widely practiced. It is embedded in the English language. This determines what the meaning of the word manager is. It is everywhere, almost like a virus. It's highly contagious. And of course, these principles and processes are deeply embedded in the minds and processes of the organization. They can be very hard to change. The principles and processes worked very well for a very long time, but then the world changed. There were four main changes. First, the pace of change. The whole world started to speed up the global competition. Then, secondly, amazing new technology appeared on the scene. Thirdly, knowledge work. Most work turned into knowledge work, and now workers often knew as much, if not more, than the bosses. And the customer, most important, power in the marketplace shifted to the customer. The customer had information and options, and so the customer became, in effect, the boss of the firm. Firms found it very difficult to deal with these changes. They couldn't change fast enough to keep up with the pace of change, or the shifts in technology. When the workers knew more than the bosses, it didn't make sense for the bosses to be telling the workers what to do. What the customer wanted shifted unpredictably. The managers did their best to fix the machine. They replaced the staff, they downsized, they reorganized, they delayed, they re-engineered, they launched sales campaigns. The bottom line was it didn't work. It wasn't that the machine was broken. The problem was that the firm wasn't a machine at all. It had become something different. And so in the early 2000s, some firms started saying, let's do something different. At the time, they were small, unknown startups, Amazon, Google, Hire, Morningstar, firms that no one had ever heard of. And they started experimenting with a different way of running the organization. These experiments had different names. I've called it at different times agile and radical management. Google has called it Project Aristotle. Amazon calls it two pizza teams. The US military has called it Mission Command. Hire talks about Rendenhai. Professor Birkinshaw calls it adhocracy. I'm currently calling it 21st century management. There are all these different names, but I'm going to be suggesting to you that leading firms have converged on a set of common principles and processes that are, in fact, the exact opposite of 20th century management principles and processes. In effect, the goal shifted from making products for sale to creating value for customers and users. Profits became the result, not the goal. The structure of work changed. Individuals, instead of reporting to bosses, following rules, joined together in small self-organizing teams working in short cycles. And the dynamic changed from a vertical hierarchy of authority to a horizontal network of competence. Let me say a little bit about each of these principles. First, the goal of the firm. Instead of the 20th century goal of creating the perfect product in a reliable and timely fashion, they embraced Peter Drucker's dictum of 1954. There is only one valid purpose of a firm: to create a customer. In these firms, there is an obsession with creating more value for customers and users. That became the driving force, the goal of the organization. The customer was now the boss. And this was a fundamental paradigm shift in management. It was almost as transformational as the Copernican revolution in astronomy, when it became apparent to Copernicus, and eventually to all of us, that contrary to the evidence of our own eyes, the sun is not revolving around the earth. The earth is actually revolving around the sun. Similarly, in management, it became apparent that a firm is not the center of the commercial universe. In fact, it is the customer, the user, who is at the center of the commercial universe. The firm is somewhere on the periphery, and its future depends on whether it can provide value to the customer. The customer is the boss of the organization. The shift from products to outcomes led to other key shifts. Instead of an internal mindset with a preoccupation on internal processes and outputs, there was an external mindset with a preoccupation on customer outcomes. Instead of thinking forwards about how to induce customers to buy our products, there was a shift to thinking backwards from what the customer might need or want, and then figuring out how to deliver that regardless of internal processes and structures. I often hear from senior managers that this is nothing new. The customer is something we've always paid attention to. We've always had customer orientation in our firm. But there's a huge difference between customer obsession and customer orientation. It's not that such firms didn't pay attention to the customer, they did. They tried to figure out what the customer wanted, but then the focus shifted to how to produce that within the constraints of the existing structures and processes of the firm. If what the customer wanted could be accommodated, that was fine, but if not, it would have to wait to another day. It was, in effect, a conditional commitment to the customer. In this new mode of management, if the existing structures and processes weren't compatible with what the customer wanted, then those structures and processes had to be changed. The customer was the genuine boss of the organization. Secondly, the structure of work had to change. In order to deliver on this very different and much more difficult goal, work had to draw on the talents of all the staff. This was the opposite of bureaucracy, with individuals reporting to bosses. It was basically self-organization, typically with small self-organizing teams working in short cycles, able to understand customers, interact with them, try something different, and gradually iterate towards something that would actually create more value for the customer. It was a very different way of organizing work in an organization. It was also a huge decentralization of authority. It was a shock to the bureaucracy. It meant change in the role of manager from being a controller to an enabler. It meant that the firm had to be much more explicit and clearer about the firm's overall goal. It also meant there had to be a way of measuring whether the teams were delivering in real time. It was a shift from outputs to outcomes. Each team had a clear line of sight to the customer and could see whether or not their firm was delivering value. Often they found they were not delivering value to any customer, and so why were they doing that work at all? The firms also discovered the need for continuous integration. Initially, they proceeded like 20th century hardware firms. The specifications were developed for each part of the system they were building. Each team worked on its part in accordance with the specifications, and when they were done, they came together. And the idea was that everything would be integrated, but it never worked this way. There were always unexpected things that prevented integration. And so a great deal of rework was necessary. Billions of dollars were lost. They found they had to integrate as they went along. They discovered, in effect, the need for continuous integration. And thirdly, the dynamic of work had to change. Instead of a vertical hierarchy of authority, there was a horizontal network of competence. Now ideas could come from anywhere in the organization, sideways, up, down, whatever was necessary. It was a network, not a vertical hierarchy of authority. The point was that ideas could come from anywhere. It wasn't the innovation group or the strategy group that came up with new ideas. Talent was now distributed throughout the organization, and ideas needed to come from anywhere. The role at the top was to nurture and encourage this horizontal sharing of ideas. After firms had mastered these very different principles, the firms got another shock. In the 2010s, many of these firms discovered that their processes were at odds with their 21st century principles. They found that their back offices were working in accordance with 20th century principles and at odds with and undermining everything that the operations were trying to accomplish. So they set about creating new processes that were in line with 21st century principles. They had to reinvent these processes. In leadership, instead of transactional leadership, they had to become inspirational and encouraging at every level. Instead of strategy focusing on coping with competition, strategy had to become dynamic and future-looking. Innovation was not just enhancing existing businesses, it was creating new businesses. Talent management and treating people as people, not resources to be controlled and managed as disposable things. So these radically different processes started to develop. Among those changes, talent management was central. The role became to attract and nurture talent. The firm desperately needed people interested in with the skills in managing arenas where such ideas could be presented and boosted and supported. And it was the top that set the tone. Once that was done, they finally had a coherent way of running the organization in a way that was fit for the 21st century. Examples are well known, like Amazon, Hire, Netflix. How does this new management happen? Some firms started with a fresh sheet, like Tesla, and that made things easier. Other firms like Amazon have decided to manage part of their organization in a 21st century way, but also manage part of their organization in a 20th century way. Other firms are busy transforming the whole organization to the 21st century manner. And in all of these cases, the role of the top management is key. It's essential that the executives understand the structure of the products in order to support speed. They need to master the relationships between the different pieces of the system in order to support speed. And they need to nurture the necessary changes in mindset and processes throughout the firm. Perhaps the most frequent cause of failure transformation is the lack of support from the top. One example is Microsoft, which shows that these changes don't happen overnight. I visited Microsoft in 2004 when it was a very slow-moving bureaucracy. I had thought the World Bank was bureaucratic, but it had nothing on Microsoft in 2004. From 2008 to 2014, there was a kind of an underground movement introducing these changes. But it was very much a rebel movement. And the reaction was, why do we have to do what they are doing? But once Satya Nadella, who had been a champion of the change, became chief executive in 2014, the tone shifted. And now it was not why do we have to do that, but how do we get what they are having? And so Microsoft embraced the whole change across the whole organization. So I'm hoping that this talk gives you an illustration of the kind of issues that we're facing. I'd be happy to answer questions about any aspects of it.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. I think that's whetted our appetites for 21st century management. I suppose the obvious question is, why is 20th century management so difficult to the legacy of it, so difficult to shake off? What are the impediments?
Well, it is embedded in the mindsets of, in a large organization. Hundreds of thousands of people have made their careers, been highly successful. And in the 20th century, it was a very successful way of running an organization. And so it comes as a shock that everything they knew, everything they believed in, everything they thought was central to running a successful organization didn't work anymore. And so it is a transformational shift in mindsets. As I showed on the Microsoft, they worked at it for 10 years really to make it happen. So it's becoming essential because, as I say, running the firm in the old way doesn't work anymore. So this becomes apparent to the executives. So there is this financial pressure to change, but it's taking a long time, and I'm doing what I can to speed it up.
Yeah, it is amazing, though, because you can see once you start talking about the legacies of 20th century management, you can see it all around you. I suppose the counter to what you said about customers, if customers are the center of the commercial universe, why doesn't it feel like it?
I mean, they are the center of the universe collectively. In a sense, I might not be able to make much impact on Microsoft or General Electric, but when General Electric doesn't pay attention to the customer, they, in due course, although they purport to be going through some of these changes, they suffered very severely financially, and so their appliance division was bought by Hire and becoming much more successful when it's run in a 21st century fashion.
Yeah, because I suppose GE was a quintessential 20th century management success story.
In many ways, although Jack Welch eventually, 2009, came to see that this way of running an organization didn't make sense, and had a revelatory moment. But at the time, he was the quintessential 20th century manager.
Yeah, it's a pity he had his revelatory moment after he'd stopped being the CEO, I suppose. So, thank you very much, Steve, for setting the scene for what the shape of 21st century management will look like, hopefully. As Steve said, it is already happening in a small number of really exciting organizations like Spotify and Netflix. And now we're going to learn more about one company. I mean, it's astonishing, really, that when I started writing about business, which was 30 or so years ago, the idea that a Chinese company would be held up as a managerial role model was beyond comprehension. I mean, that was beyond the wildest dreams and imagination. But this is what happened. That the Hire story is a truly remarkable one, and we're really fortunate today. We have two experts on what is happening at Hire and what has happened at Hire with us. We're going to be joined shortly by Bill Fisher. Bill's a professor at IMD Business School in Switzerland, now based in New York. He's the author of the brilliant book Reinventing Giants, which tells the Hire story, amongst much more. And Bill's going to be joined by Kevin Nolan, who's the CEO of GE Appliances, and could tell you from the horse's mouth exactly what Hire's model and 21st century management means in practice if you're based in Louisville, Kentucky. It's an amazing story. Bill, over to you.
Great, thanks, Stuart. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be with so many great panelists. I have to, and also as I look through the chat session and the participants, I see a lot of familiar names. It's nice to have you here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by giving you my impressions of what's happening in Hire and what Rendankhui means to an organization. And then I'm going to invite Kevin to come in and share his perspective on how that agrees with what's going on in Louisville. So let me begin by talking about the Rendankhui story as we see it in Qingdao. And so this is very Qingdao specific, and it's my interpretation. So and what I want you to understand is that this is a story of an organization that went from nearly being bankrupt in 1984 to being a world leader today, the leader in the world home appliance industry. And I want you to also understand that this is a 40-year-old story, which is not the case when we talk about Louisville. But this has been going on for nearly 4 decades, and it's been going on in a continuous fashion, which is important. It's not been episodic, and it's been all about dreams and details. So if you started in 1984, what you saw was an organization that was truly on the ropes financially. This is a television snapshot of the destruction of 70 some odd refrigerators that were in finished goods inventory but didn't work, and a commitment, a very vivid commitment by leadership that from now on Hire was going to be producing products that did work, and they were going to brand them as well. And what came out of that today is an organization which is at the forefront of the appliance industry and very much about the smart home of the future. So we'll see how they've made that transition. But it's also a story about a large incumbent market leader, and not only a large incumbent market leader, but an organization that was in what was traditionally thought of as an old economy industry, and their efforts to stay relevant, no matter what the challenges. This is not about a bunch of kids in Silicon Valley in flip-flops and shorts, creating great teams. This is about 70,000 real people making real products. And the scale and the nature of the industry is important when you think about how this works. So, and what the message is. So this is about what I think is important is that it's a mixture of creativity and discipline. It's what are we going to do? And I'm using the business model canvas because I think the conversations within Hire were precise, like you'd get out of a business model canvas, but of course they weren't using it at that point in time. What are we going to do? And that's about the dreams. We're going to be the leading home appliance company in China. We're going to have a great brand. We're going to outdo the foreign rivals. You know, dream after dream after dream that all were energizing. Plus, and the plus is critical, right? Plus, how are we going to do it? What are the managerial choices that we're going to make to make this possible? So if you think about what Steve just spoke about principles and processes, I think the dreams are really, in my case, about the processes, and the details will get one level further down into practices. But that doesn't mean we're going to, and this is the book that Stuart mentioned. This really now talks about the first three decades of the higher experience. But what I want you to see is the principles are really important. Hire, and you'll see this in a second, Hire's transformation journey went from believing that quality was critical to the customer and brand was essential, and they then implemented changes around metrics and incentives to make that possible, to once that was successful and they were the leading domestic appliance manufacturer, to recognizing that they now had foreign competitors, familiar foreign competitors from North America, Japan, and Europe to compete against, and they needed to be responsive. They had a home field advantage being close to the customer. They needed to turn that into a business advantage. So they built a new structure. They recreated, they reinvented the company. And then in 2005, deciding that responsiveness wasn't enough, that as we entered a digital economy, that being intimate with the customer, knowing the customer better than the customer knew themselves, was the ultimate advantage. And then they built an organization. They reinterpreted the organization again so that they could do this. So when you look at Hire, what first grabs your attention, I think, is the changes in their organization. But I want this conversation to go beyond that. I think the changes in the organization are profound, but there's also the principles, the processes, and the practices that we need to think about. And that's particularly true when you think about the complexity of the Internet of Things hitting the home, the smart home of the future, with all of the sensors and controls, but all of the areas of expertise and the changed customer journey that no one in the industry was really prepared for. So I'm going to rely on Gary Hamel and Michelle Zanini's vocabulary. We'll first look at principles, then we'll look at processes, and we'll look at practices. But I think what you'll also see unfolding, and this is where Steve's, and then the world change comment becomes important. What you'll see is that you need to go deep into the conversation. You need to understand what exactly do we want to do and how are we going to do it. And so the starting point, I think, for thinking about Rendon and Hire is that it's a philosophy. It's a philosophy more than anything else. And it's based on two overriding principles that have never changed since 1984. The first is that we're going to provide a great customer experience. And the second is we're going to rely on our own entrepreneurial energies to do that. And if we do that, we can, if we keep those two constant, everybody understands where we're going and what this is all about, then we can experiment with the processes. So when we think about processes at Hire, one of the major areas of process experimentation has been relationship with customers. Hire today is talking about the 3 zeros. We're going to have zero distance between us and the customer. If we achieve that, then the people close to the customer really don't need to go to headquarters to get approvals. So we're going to have zero approvals. And with zero approvals, there ought to be zero delays. So we'll move faster in support of that better customer experience. We'll also make decisions differently as a process. We'll insist that everybody's an entrepreneur. That's one of our principles, entrepreneurial energy. And we'll give them the right to make decisions, the right to hire and fire, and the right to distribute rewards. So we'll go beyond talking about them as entrepreneurs. They'll be entrepreneurs. And then the third thing is, as a result of that, Because if you create entrepreneurs and then put them in an old organization, then you have angry entrepreneurs, right? So we'll change the organization dramatically. We'll move from an inverted pyramid that was ultimately still inside out to an ecosystem model that's radically open and very much outside in. And so what we'll see over time is that there's two very important new processes that are operating here. One is that we're going to not only call people entrepreneurs and give them the rights to make decisions, but we're going to share the results with them. We're going to share the results if they're profitable, and we're going to share the results if they're not. And so we're going to distribute the value created. And then I think the second process that really has emerged center stage is we're going to be radically open. When Steve said ideas could come from anywhere, for 30 years, that was true, but the ideas anywhere was inside of Hire. Today, it's anywhere, outside of Hire, inside of Hire, it doesn't matter. We're also going to experiment with practices. Now, practices are granular choices that we're going to make. And we're going to look at things like, what does it take to start a micro enterprise? We're going to establish a low gate so that people can do this easily, 3 colleagues together, and you can sell that idea. We're going to require that the entrepreneurs, if they're really going to be entrepreneurs, need to play a role in getting the resources for investment. In fact, in most cases, they're going to supply the seed funds to get their micro enterprise up and running. Easy to start, but you got to fund it as well. We're going to let these micro enterprises compete within reason on the platforms they belong to. So it'll not be unusual to see 2 micro enterprises side by side who are actually competing with each other for the customer's choice. We're going to talk about value distribution, and then we're going to build precise ways of doing it so that it's more than a casual aspiration, but it actually is something we can rely on. We're going to build leading targets that are forward-facing, future-facing, rather than past-based. We're going to build an app so that I can challenge your goals and suggest I can do it better. And we're going to use bidding, as a way to improve performance. So if I think I can outdo you in running a micro enterprise, I'm going to have the opportunity to do it. It's going to be easy to do it. I'll take my smartphone out and put a better number in as my target, and we'll see if we can convince the micro enterprise to go with me. And then we're going to rethink the way we coordinate so that we're going to build small enterprise micro communities so that we have independent units who are cooperating in order to give a better customer experience. Attention to this level of detail gives you a higher likelihood of achieving very bold and daring goals because everyone knows what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, and who's going to do it. So let me just recap. 35 years of, or almost 40 years now, of continuous change, which is a huge advantage. Everybody comes to work at Hire expecting change. Nobody is surprised by change. And it becomes not only a real part of the brand that the consumer sees, but it becomes a real part of the brand that the aspirant employee sees. So nobody comes to Hire looking for a slow life. It's always been aimed at the same 2 objectives over nearly 40 years. Better customer experience. Everyone is an entrepreneur. And that consistency in the objectives, I believe, really makes it easier for people to figure out what's happening and create the why that Steve spoke about. Constant experimentation at the process and practice level, always adjusting. Everything's in flux. Every new vision is ambitious and stretching. There's no modesty about what Hire's trying to do. Even though the managerial choices are granular, the dreams are big. And so what you see is big strategic changes building on small tactics. The value of familiarity, the same process performance management system, 35 years. You may be being asked to take big risks, but you know how those risks are going to be measured. There's going to be no change. We're not asking you to jump into the unknown. We're asking you to hold onto the banister as you go down the steps or up the steps and move fast. Hire has consistently changed transformation before it had to. So it not only creates new opportunities for its customers and partners, but it destabilizes the competition at the same time. So, you know, in a very quick period of time, that's my belief as to what's going on in Hire. But now we have somebody who really knows what's going on in Hire. We have Kevin Nolan, who is the president and CEO of General Electric Appliances in Louisville. What can I tell you about Kevin? He's a good guy. I think that's true. He'll agree. He's an engineer. He's a patent recipient. He's done work. He's won recognition. What I find particularly interesting is he's been with GE all his entire career, but he's worked in Europe, he's worked in China, and he's worked in the US. And he spent as much as a year in China in Qingdao as the chief technology officer of Hire. And that was his sort of first immersion into the world of Hire. So he has a real insider's view. So Kevin, welcome. It's great to have you here. It's always great to be with you.
Thank you, Bill.
Could you just give us, to start out with, could you give us an overview on General Electric Appliances sort of before and after the acquisition of Hire, and what's changed and how it's progressing?
Okay, so that's a big question. So we'll try to go through it. You know, GE Appliances, we've had a long heritage, really dating back to Thomas Edison. So it's an old business. It's one, we're a very proud business of what we do and the business we run. Started originally up along the Erie Canal, and about 55 years ago or so, we moved here to Louisville, Kentucky as the headquarters. Where we are now, it's a very large manufacturing and headquarters. We have 4, over 1 million square foot factories. I'm actually looking out across a parking lot at those factories. But we're also located in Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia. We have manufacturing facilities. So we were a good business under GE. We always, we're well run. We prided ourselves in that. We prided ourselves in the discipline and our processes and how we went to market. But we were, I would say, a very stable business. So we were a business that, I started at GE in Connecticut. I moved here 23 years ago to the appliance businesses. And through those 23 years, it never really changed too much. We were always around a $6 billion business. We always had good cash flow, but there was never really growth. It was more about predictability. And it was about every year making sure that we could generate the cash. And that's the way I think the business looked at us, as well-run business, a good business for people to kind of learn their careers, to kind of hone their skills. So we had a lot of people coming in and out of this business. You look at, you name chairmans across, Jeff Emmel, while he was here, he ran the service business. So we really saw the who's who of folks. Dave Cody came through here. So we had a lot of very, I would say, smart folks come through this business, but it was looked at as a training ground. And for those of us that were always with the business, I think we didn't realize the kind of damage that would cause over time, because you always had a rotating door, and you had people that were here to kind of learn management. They were here to, get an education. They weren't really here because I think they loved our business or where we were going to drive the business. That all changed about 4 years ago. GE had tried to sell us in 2008. We had a financial crisis that made that fall through. But then they went and not only tried to, but did sell us about 4 years ago. And we got sold to Haier, which we didn't really know much about. So Haier is an interesting company. Unlike a lot of the, whether it's Korean companies or Chinese companies that did a lot of OEM work that we were very familiar with, Haier was always very much about their brand and themselves as a company and didn't value OEM work. So out of all the people that maybe potentially could have bought us, the one that we knew the least is the one that did. So it was I would say, a traumatic time for us of coming with all this pride of being part of GE and then no longer. And if you look back 4 years ago, is kind of when people started to see some weaknesses with GE, but not yet. So we left at a time when I think things were still kind of okay. And so for myself personally, I felt, I knew the company I'd worked for forever, but I didn't know this new company. So I took it upon myself. I said, we've got to learn what they're about, what they think. And it was a very interesting company to start with because, first thing you want to see is you want to see an org chart. You want to see, what is the company about? What are its procedures? What are policies? And we heard just these crazy things like Rondon Hui. We heard, when we asked for an org chart, well, we don't really have one. And what's the structure of the work? How's work done? No real clear answers on that. So when I went there, it became even more confusing because what I was used to seeing didn't exist. Even there, I thought, well, maybe they just don't have an org chart published. But people there were questioning, well, that's not really how we work. We're more of a network company. We're more about open platforms and we're about micro enterprises. And it just seemed like there was micro enterprises everywhere, thousands of them. And how does work get done? And I used to spend my days just trying to figure out how does work get done? Because you'd see products leaving the facilities every day, but so somehow engineering was getting done, marketing was getting done, sales were getting done, but not at all like I was used to. And it took a while to start really unwinding what is this about, and then really thinking, well, how would this apply to our company? Because I think that's the issue is how do you translate? Because every market's different, and so the China market is still an emerging market in many ways. You look at products like dishwashers, where there's basically 100% penetration in the U.S. There's very low penetration in China. So in some markets, it's still like 1950s in the US. In other areas like refrigeration are mature. So it's an interesting, example, and it's very easy to discount, say, oh, that might work in China, but that won't work in the US. And I think that was our initial response from GE Appliances. And there was a lot of resistance to what they were doing and how they were doing it and saying it won't work in our market. But I started to see some things that seemed interesting, just this entrepreneurial spirit of a big company, just the intensity of how they looked at the market, and this, you call almost maniacal focus on the consumer. And that's all they talked about. It was a very outward facing organization of how they worked. So when I became CEO, we really looked at, how could we change things? So we started adopting principles of micro enterprises. We changed our organization from a functional organization led, that was very efficient. I think that's what GE grew up on, is really efficiency and processes and predictability, to how do we make this more of a dynamic, customer facing, customer focused organization that's nimble in the markets that we serve. And how do you change the role of a CEO? So that was a main thing, is I quickly realized I could not do this job like I've seen people do it for the years that I've worked there. I had to change my own work, my own way of doing things. And how do you take this job and really put the CEO at the bottom of the organization and the people that are touching the consumers and touching our users at the top of the organization? So that's really what we've been going through for the last 3 years, is that transformation to how do we get that kind of market intensity, that customer focus that I think has made Haier the company that they are.
So Kevin, you told me once that you're moving towards micro enterprises, but you're interpreting it differently than they do in Qingdao, and yet apparently successfully enough so that you've done away with your corporate strategy group. Is that true? How do micro enterprises differ in Louisville?
Yeah. So initially what we did is our company was basically 4 major product lines. You think you've got refrigerators, you've got cooking products, you've got dishwashers, and you've got laundry. And that's how we had product managers of those 4 different groups. So we started with four micro enterprises, right? And so we started to say, hey, how can we make those become more of businesses on their own that are working on their goals and their metrics to drive their success and compensate them differently. So we started with that, but then the thing that I learned from Hire is you have to let things organically develop. And so we started to see employees say, hey, to add focus and intensity, some of those big microenterprise we broke down into smaller ones. And now we have about 14. Actually, we always argue, how many do we have? How many don't we have? So I think Hire's been at this, like I think you said, 15 years. We've been at it about 3. So it's still evolving. I think that's part of what's interesting with Hire is it's never the same. It's always something new. It's always looking at what are practices to improve. So that's the journey we've been on, is how do we let employees, like we've just recently gotten into the RV market. Now, some, as you can say, it was luck because no one knew COVID was coming. But that really happened with 3 employees just saying that, hey, there's an opportunity there. And I think one of them likes RVs. So one day in my office, I see an RV show up with our brand on the side of it. Didn't know what it was about. But I think that when I knew something was different, because before you would have had to have all kinds of approvals, all kinds of reviews. And it really made me feel good that as the CEO, I didn't know what was going on. Things were happening that I wasn't aware of. And then I said, now we're on to something. Now something special seems to be occurring that is much different than did before.
Kevin, you talk about the role of the CEO as something that you are intimately familiar with, right? The changing role. What's been the biggest changes in what you do and how you do it?
I think it's being careful of reviews, PowerPoint. I mean, that's what it was before. As CEOs, you sit behind a desk and people come to you. And you review and you tell them, are they doing a good job or are they doing a bad job? And that's not what this can be about. This needs to be more about, how can you help and can you enable microenterprises? So like recently we've gotten into small appliances. That's a new microenterprise. We've launched those in the recent months, but it's more about what do we need to do to help? So, distribution. Do we have the right distribution for smalls that we do for large? So it's more about talking to microenterprise and say, how are our platforms behaving? Because now we look at things as platforms. So our distribution business needs to serve the microenterprises. Before, distribution kind of ran a lot of things. Like, that's not the case. Are they serving the microenterprises to the best of their ability? If they're not, then we can go outside. So there needs to be this internal competition with the external world of, if you're not serving things well, we'll go outside and we'll find someone who can and who can serve it in a better manner. So a lot as my role is making sure that these microenterprises are able to leverage our platforms in the best way, and our platforms evolving quick enough as our business changes.
What would you say is the biggest challenge you face going forward? I mean, where's the sticking point at the moment?
I think the big challenge is what everyone's dealing with right now. The world is so dynamic. I mean, if anyone believed that they could plan properly and, they could predict the future, I think finally they realized they can't. I think a lot of people had this false sense of prediction and knowing here's what to do, here's my plans. And, people put these 5-year plans together. Well, whose 5-year plan said we're going to have a pandemic and the whole world's going to be upside down? Nobody's. And so how much time was spent? How much inefficiency was spent on those? And isn't it better in the world we live in now to be working on nimbleness, to be working on adaptability, to be working on flexibility? And I think that's what we need to drive in the future. And that's what is going to differentiate companies. Those that plan, I think, are going to be obsolete. We all do need to plan in some extent, but those that can react and those that can adapt are the ones that are going to flourish. And how do we become those companies?
So, Kevin, at this point, I'm gonna ask Stuart to come back, and we'll do this in a panel format. But those were great responses. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Kevin. I mean, what strikes me, what's amazing about the Hire and GE Appliances story is that it's a completely different approach to acquisitions. I mean, historically, if let's say an American company acquired a British company, it'd be kind of colonization. Whereas it seems much more subtle, the process you've been through, Kevin, of learning about the Hire culture. I mean, I presume when Hire took you over, did they send hundreds of managers over to tell you in Louisville how to do things?
No. And I think if it would be the opposite with the British assuming a US company, but but they really didn't. And that was interesting for us is, you know, if you're here now, we're very independent. We're actually more independent than we were when we were under GE as far as the kind of reporting and what we need to do. So we were looking for that at first. Like, what's your policies? What's your processes? You know, because when GE did take over, we came in like the Roman army. And we sat down of here's the systems you're going to do. Here's how you're going to behave. Here's the reviews. So we came in very hard whenever we made an acquisition. But that is not what we found at all with High Air. And it was hard for us at first because we were expecting that, but it never came. And it took us, I would say, about a year to realize we were on our own to figure things out.
I mean, the thing that's always struck me, I think you alluded to it, Kevin, with Hire, is that I visited Hire a number of times and I've been guided around and things have been explained to me as they have to Bill. And a lot of it remains a complete mystery. I'm actually paying attention, but things change so quickly. And is there capacity for their willingness to embrace ambiguity and the high levels of trust?
Yeah, and what I've seen is they're very open-minded to see what's happening. And part of this theory is I think what's going to make companies successful is experimentation. So they never want to tell you how to do anything. And it is disconcerting at first because you kind of want approval. Are we doing things the way you want? So they're very much on, you need to understand your markets. You know, they're very much also to build things and make things in your markets because you're close to the customer. So there's this concept of zero distance. So a lot of people thought, oh, we're going to be taken over by a Chinese company. We're going to make everything in China. We've had more investment in US production than we ever had under GE. So we have much more of a domestic manufactured policy now than we did in the past. And it's really a testament to High Air's philosophy of you need to be with your customer and that zero distance. The closer you can get, the more successful you're going to be.
Yeah, really interesting points, Kevin. So it'd be good to bring in Annika and Steve at this point. And it strikes me one of the big messages, Steve, from what you were saying is, and what Kevin's saying and Bill, is the primacy of customers. And it always strikes me, what's so scary about customers for CEOs and C-level executives?
Well, when they're looking at things from a 20th century management perspective, they are looking at the internal structures and processes. And it's not that they ignored the customer. They all say, we have a customer orientation. But as I say, it's a kind of a conditional commitment to the customer. We will do what the customer wants and needs, but only so far as it's consistent with our existing structures and processes. And so many of the things that the customers want don't fit. And as a result, they don't get exactly what they want. And the companies that have embraced this, like Hire and Amazon and whatnot, what the customer wants is an absolute obsession. And that if something in the organization is preventing that a structure or a process or the fact that we don't make it, then find a solution. Start making it or find another partner that can make it. We have to actually solve the customer's need and problem. And so you see that these firms not just run their existing business well, they keep creating new businesses as they keep finding new needs and finding profitable ways of meeting those needs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point, which Bill made, that at Hire they say everyone is an entrepreneur, which reminds me of the line, everyone is a leader, which people used to say kind of 20 years ago. And I always thought, well, they're not, are they? And not everyone is an entrepreneur. I mean, that's a fact though, Bill, isn't it? That not everybody can be an entrepreneur in the same way not everybody can be a leader.
But
how do you fit in at Hire if you're not entrepreneurial? Or is that impossible?
First of all, after doing this for 40 years, if you show up at Hire and you find out by mistake they want entrepreneurs, you're in the wrong place, right? You know, you go there because you're attracted to that opportunity. And then they make it easy. They've built an infrastructure to make it easy to be an entrepreneur, easy to get a micro enterprise up and running, easy to get funding to some extent, easy to start.
There's a very good question from Frank Kalberg, which I think is a good one for you, actually, Bill. What ideas from hire can parliaments around the world use to innovate? And which I think is interesting, because I think parliaments and government should learn from the business world. But I know Hire's applying its ideas in healthcare, for instance, isn't it?
Yes, they own at least 2 hospitals, and they have a biomedical platform. I think that's a great question. I think that the first thing that comes to mind is that Hire's radically open. So when Steve says good ideas from anywhere, we should ask our political leaders to be more responsive to ideas from outside their traditional circle of, I don't want to use the word cronies, but I can't figure out a different word to put in there. But the Hire has expanded its mindset so that every idea has merit as long as there are people who are willing to work with it.
We should also note that the public sector is not absent from this scene. Many parts of the US government, the British government, are embracing these ideas with energy, and Department of Defense is a hotbed of this, and the whole Government Accounting Office in the US has a whole initiative aimed at coordinating all of these activities across the US government that are underway. Now, it often doesn't percolate up to the top of the parliamentary leaders, who are often not well informed about what's happening, but beneath the surface, there's a huge amount of this energy going on within the public sector.
Well, that's good. That's good to hear. Annika, it'd be good to bring you in at this point. We've heard about 21st century management, and it seems there's only a very small group of companies are actually putting this into practice. Are there any companies you would like to highlight?
Absolutely. So I started my own quest and mission to search for this new management model around 10 years ago. And at that point in time, it was Silicon Valley that was the cradle for new management innovation. So it was natural for me to start looking at the Google model. And today I know the Renan Hui model as well, pretty well, even if it's complicated, as we heard before. It's a very complex organizational model. The Google model was the same. It took me almost a year to actually understand that as well, but it's run on more or less exactly the same principles. And then I went further. So we have other companies. We heard about Tesla, for example, that Stephen mentioned, Facebook, Spotify, a Swedish company, has been running their organization on exactly the same principle. And it's what made me very positive is that I see the same things, the themes, the same principle coming up. But to Kevin's point, you have to find your own way of doing it. If you are healthcare, or if you are a private company in a certain country, you need to start with something that makes sense for you, and you usually start with some of the components, right? So I do think that many organizations are on their way to this new model. The question will be it be too slow? Will we see a number of them, vanishing from the top list because they just were too slow? And can we help them to speed up the process? And I do think we need a lot of learning across organization from those organizations that have been deciding to take the lead and seeing the light before the others, the early adopters, and then to the others that need to have help now to start moving and changing their way of running. Otherwise, they will not survive.
I'd endorse what Annika says, that there are a huge number of companies that are on this track. In fact, almost any company of any size now, if you look inside the company, you will find a hotbed of people who are pursuing this way of running the organization, particularly in software, because it's been shown that it's impossible to run software in any other way. So tens of thousands of organizations all around the world are doing this. The big constraint is that I hear is that the top management in these firms starts to get alarmed when they find that the software people are actually moving faster than the rest of the organization, and the practices that they're introducing into the firm are at odds with the way the company is run, and you get that kind of a clash. But what's happened is the largest, most valuable firms on the planet got to be the largest firms on the planet because they're operating this way. So Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Netflix, Tesla, all of those firms doing this. So the lesson for business is very large and very prominent. And really the message is change or die.
I think, you know, a thought that I always have too is our boards. If you look at companies, a lot is relying on the board, and do the boards of these established companies, are they progressive enough to see this kind of trend coming? And do you have the right senior management that can adapt and can move into this world we're all living in right now?
Well, basically the answer is no.
That is a very relevant question. I actually have experience from 4 different boards, and I can definitely say it's a huge problem. I would say that the board is a problem that is usually not even mentioned and discussed. We all look at, you know, the executive team of the organization and down and blame the executive team, but the executive team in itself is affected and influenced by the board. And we find more or less the same kind of breed of people in most of the boards, and they are the old generation, you know, mindset. And I have been personally fighting for just getting acceptance of for example, in one company, to help an acquisition they did of a new business that needed to become like a micro enterprise. It needed to be decoupled from the organization, otherwise it would have been killed. And I failed. I couldn't convince it. So they start to integrate the whole new businesses and new digital media or digital technology instead in their current processes and practices, with the effect of pretty marginal, you know, result in growth and revenue. So it's very hard.
Let's work through some of the questions from the people who are watching. Some really good questions. There's kind of a theme emerging from some of them. I see Ellen Dick from the Corporate Rebels in Holland is asking this question. How do you create psychological safety in these sorts of environments? Because people are scared things go wrong. They're very ambiguous environments, they're fast changing, but how do you create the confidence in individuals that they can take risks, they can do things?
I mean, my take is the role of the top managers is crucial. That the successful transitions have happened because the top reaches out and finds the islands of excellence, finds the entrepreneurs, finds the champions within the organization, and then celebrates them and recognizes them and asks other parts of the organization to visit and learn from them, and they become the models and they get promoted. And before you know it, you start to have a movement, and the people who are not in sync with this start to find that the organization is not compatible with what they're doing. So that very much the climate is determined by the top of the organization.
Yeah, I think a big role a leader has to play right now is because no one can take crazy risks. I mean, we need to run a company, you need to be profitable, you need to hit your numbers. So I think a lot of what we spend time is train people of how to take risks, because risks are only risky when you bet the farm. And then so we do a lot here to teach, you know, if we see a new opportunity in the market, how do you get in light and how do you get in and experiment and how can you be agile? So I think that's a lot of the learning that needs to happen in organizations right now, is to teach an organization how to experiment and how to learn. And then the risks aren't huge risks. It becomes a natural thing of experimentation and trying. And I'd say that's a lot of what I spend my time on, you know, coaching and looking at how can you lower the risk to get into a new area and to see if there's an opportunity there?
It's a good question from, I mean, obviously, some people you don't really expect to take risks. For instance, the people in charge of finance. How do you change the mindset of, say, a CFO? Is a question from Brian Lapidus. So you've got a CFO who's obviously risk averse, careful. How do you get, and wants certainty? How do you get people in those sorts of roles on board?
Well,
Well, I think.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Stephen. I think with, I know with our CFO is they play a very important role is you've got to make sure you're taking appropriate risks and you're appropriately allocating capital. So we become very open to microenterprise starting, but it doesn't mean you're going to allocate a ton of capital for that experiment. So I think they play a role, but they've got to also meter on, okay, if we want to get into that, there's got to be a limit till we see some kind of revenue, some kind of proof that it's a good opportunity or not. So I think they've got to be there, and they're good at recognizing risks, but also putting pressure on, you've got to lower your experimentation cost.
You also need to start from their perspective that they are thinking a lot about risk. So let's talk about risk. Let's talk about the risks that you're currently running by continuing to run the organization in this 20th century fashion. Let's start to see what's happened to companies that have run that way and what's happened to their and once you're starting to talk about risk in their terms, then you can move on to say, well, how could we reduce those risks? Then you start to have a conversation. But if you come in and start to say we're going to run the organization in a radically different way, then obviously they're not even listening to what you're saying. They're trying to figure out how to get you out of their office.
And I would like to echo on that too. Something that I learned from the company I've been looking at is that you have to, as Kevin said, you have to make it, the risk need to be perceived as, not costly. It need to be, it has to be a limited cost with taking the risk of, for example, through experimentation. And then fear is an important driver to make any change happening, as Stephen is highlighting on as well. That what is the alternative, and create a fear of maybe not experimenting, of staying where you are. But it's very much a culture. It's very much focusing on culture. And I love what you said, Kevin, that you believe that it's very much training the people in new practices, like taking risk. It's allowed to take risks and lower the perceived cost of doing that through creating an environment of where you can experiment.
I think and a benefit we have is I think there's been a big realization that the way we were running our business before under GE was extremely risky because we weren't moving fast. We were so process oriented. And I think that's been a big advantage I've had, is just to say, hey, the comfortable way you did things was actually so risky. There's such a risk of not being adaptive and not moving quickly. And I think our employees have seen that. So it's enabled us to be, I think, freer to say, hey, we've got to move, we've got to try, because we saw what we did in the past just didn't work.
Here's a question for Bill from a couple of people. What does all this mean for education, business education in particular? Because I think Steve pointed out the business education world is built around 20th century management and 20th century examples. Probably still there's a case study of Jack Welch, no doubt, being taught at somewhere, a business school somewhere in the world right now.
Well, I think clearly, first there has to be a recognition, which there isn't at the moment. I don't think that there's a change in the context in which these decisions are having to be made. And it's amazing the momentum behind legacy thinking. So you hear it everywhere, you run into it everywhere, and you have well-established and coherent and highly rewarded frameworks and concepts that are rooted in the expectation that you're going to be. It's a slow-moving world out there, and you make choices that'll last for a long time. And I think what we have to do is really change the way in which we run. I think we have to change the way we run business schools. I think we need to be more entrepreneurial. I think we probably need a healthy dose of rent-on in order to be able to take more risks and try things. And particularly now that the delivery technology is changing so rapidly as well. Actually, I think that if I can just say one more thing, I think organizations like Thinkers 50, Corporate Rebels, Boundaryless, these guys, you all are moving much faster than traditional academic institutions are. And we ought to be recognizing that as a sign of impending disruption and learn from what you're doing.
If I can add to that, as I'm a part of an institution myself, I think regarding experimentation, it's very hard to do in academic setting or institution because we are accredited. And sometimes I compare it to NASA. You don't send away a rocket to Mars with technology that you have started to experiment around, right? So we have to provide curriculum that is like 30 years or 20 years stamped quality, So we are living according to the old paradigm. But what institution could do, and what we try to do with the Renan Hui Center, is that by creating this new knowledge, we can sip that and flow that over partly to the curriculum for the students, and do experimentation by having the center aside, developing new knowledge that maybe is not part of the current curriculum, but will be in the future.
Thanks, Annika. A good question here. Gary Hamill says no organization needs more than 3 management levels. How can you make this happen? Steve, it sounds like a question for you. I think there was Peter Drucker wrote about the Catholic Church at some point. And the Catholic Church was a bit of a model for not having management levels. But in this 21st century management, how many management levels are a good idea?
0 would be one answer. If you're in a network, there is no higher steep vertical hierarchy, and so 3 is too many. But you shouldn't jump to conclusions when people or firms, some firms appear to have a number of levels. But if the firm is actually operating like a network, then it may not matter. I mean, if you take the example of the U.S. Army, where they work in Iraq, where they set up a network to run operations. There were people of all sorts of different ranks, but they were operating as a network. And it was the reality of operating as a network. It didn't really matter that people had different ranks. They talked and interacted as though the ranks didn't exist. Now, long run, you probably need to do something about the ranks, but you don't need to have a massive reorganization to start operating as a network. It's a change in the mindset.
Here's a question for Kevin. Kevin, who is now responsible for developing strategy and providing direction at GE Appliances? Is every micro enterprise working independently? And how do you track progress and whether what the employees are working on actually benefits the company as a whole? There's quite a lot in that question.
Yeah,
that's from Monica in Denmark.
No, I think that's a great, question. I think, management role now is much more leading by context, like just setting a direction of what we want to be as a company, this maniacal focus on the customer, the user. And then you've got to let the micro enterprises, drive their business, and you got to let them drive their success. So we look at a return on capital, and those micro enterprises are rewarded on that like any business. So as far as a strategy, I'd say, we just look at a general direction. Like we want to be number one in our market. We want to be the most customer focused, recognized brand that there is. But then how the micro enterprises take that and what they do with it is really up to them. I think what gets complicated in these network things are things like brand. Certain things where you want a brand to show up across micro enterprises the same. So that's the difficulty I've seen in this of where is it the pure independence of a micro enterprise and where is it that they have to follow, let's say, a brand guideline, et cetera. So I would say the strategy is at that level of micro enterprise, but there's still certain things if they want to take advantage of a brand. Now the micro enterprise can do any brand they want. We don't dictate what brand you want to use in the market. But when you do choose one, well, then there's some guidelines around it. So I think there's still a little bit of balance. But as far as strategy, you need to drive it down to the lower level. And I think, 0 is the right level for hierarchy. I mean, I don't think everyone wants to be a micro enterprise leader, but you should be able to choose what team you're on and what you're part of. And as we continue to break these down, what I see in the future is smaller and smaller teams addressing opportunities out there in the market.
Yeah, great answer, Kevin. A question from Magnus, which I think is probably one for you, Steve. Are certain cultures and countries better placed to make the transition to 21st century management? Not to generalize. But I mean, but I can see where the question, Magnus, I suspect is Scandinavian, who knows? But it seems to me that, say, a Scandinavian or a Dutch culture might be more predisposed to it than say, a British culture.
I think, cultures vary even within countries, and different parts of, say, the US culture are supportive of what we're talking about here, but other parts of the US culture are really in tension with it. So you might find a micro climate, if you like, in Silicon Valley, where it's very receptive to this idea. But there are other parts of the US where it's really very difficult to communicate these ideas. So, and the same thing I would, my limited knowledge of Scandinavia suggests that it's the same pattern there, that there are some parts of Scandinavia, like Spotify, where there's exciting innovation happening in a major scale, but other parts where it's very traditional. So I think very dangerous to generalize on this issue.
Thank you, Steve. We're running out of time here. There's a good question from Barak Goran. Can the current C-level executives embrace the new world? It's a bit like, do turkeys vote for Thanksgiving? do they have that appetite for? I mean, Kevin talked brilliantly about reversing the job of the CEO. I mean, and you talked, Steve, about or was it Bill talking about the lead from the top? But if it seems to me that CEOs have got to be the role models for these changes, but do CEOs and C-level executives have the appetite for change in your experience?
Well,
if I can just quickly, I'm sorry, Steve, if I make a comment, I think that's a difficult one. I never really wanted to be a CEO. So I think if you've got people that their whole life have strived to be a CEO, watch out, because they'll do the job that they've seen done in the past.
Yeah. Thanks, Kevin. Steve?
I mean, we see across the board. I mean, all these companies that do in fact have CEOs that are pursuing this energetically. And those that aren't, the simple message I mentioned earlier, change or die. Unless you're operating in this mode, your company is not going to be around in 5-10 years. It's that simple and that stark.
Bill, are you optimistic?
I am. I think that I know enough CEOs that I can point to who are curious, who are energetic, and who are well aware that, as Steve said, the world is changing around them and they need to get on top of that. I think that they then have to convince, it's not just enough to say we're going to change. They've got to convince people that it's possible to change. It's in their interest to change. And I think that one of the things that Hire has done so well is to make it easy to change.
Yeah, good point. So Bill, Kevin, Steve, thank you very much. That was brilliant. And thank you everyone for sending in such brilliant questions. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to all of them. And for a few final words, over to Annika.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you for a great moderation of the whole event. I hope that all of you learned something new today. We are going to continue in 2021 next year. It sounds really weird, 2021, they're already there, but that is next year. We're going to plan for new webinars such as this to disseminate more knowledge around important components and principles of the new management model. We're also coming out with courses, business courses, if anyone's interested. You can reach us on randanhui@gmail.com if you want to ask any question. And specifically, if you're interested also to be part of a small group of forward-thinking leaders that can help us to also understand your needs. If you want to be part of this smaller private community of ours, please contact us also on the randanhui@gmail.com. So thank you for today, and thank you for attending this event. Thank you, all of you. Kevin, Bill, Stuart, Stephen, fantastic. And see you in 2021.
Great. All the best.
Bye.
Bye-bye.